Please welcome our panel. When I look at the course of the Russian economy, the size and the stagnation, are we looking at an economy, a fossil fuel economy, that's in terminal decline? Vladimir Poznер.
I think that's fair to say, yes. I think that it's certainly one that's not developing for sure, and to a certain point seems to be going down, and is very strange in its makeup and in its logic, and probably poses a tremendous challenge to the future of Russia. One point, though, that I would make is that even though that's the case, by and large, never before have most Russians lived as well as they live today, even if their living standards gone down, partly because of the sanctions, partly because of other things, but by and large, Russians never lived as well as they do today. So there is no correlation really between what we see in the economy and the feelings, although public opinion polls show that poverty, money in my pocket, is the #1 issue today for most Russians.
Mark Galeotti, is that correct? Are Russians better off today than they were towards the end of the Soviet era?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no real question about that. This has always been one of the ironies that for a long time Putin was tremendously lucky. In his first 2 presidential terms, the West was distracted, oil and gas prices were high, and he had money to do everything with. He could buy off the elite and allow them to embezzle at will. He could spend money on his shiny new tanks and other toys. And at the same time, there was still enough left over for ordinary Russians to live tremendously well. Of course, the problem with that is expectations. Is actually, once you get used to the idea that your life can get better, then you notice when it doesn't get better. And particularly, it's what people's kids, people are thinking about, well, okay, what kind of life, what kind of Russia will leave for my kids? That's in some ways one of the, again, the time bombs hidden in Russia's future.
Ksenia, in the election campaign that you just fought, was the economy the biggest issue, and in what way, if it was?
Well, hello to everyone once again. Of course, poverty was actually the main issue in all the cities where I was in Russia. Poverty, the level of life, this is what was actually worrisome for most of the Russians. But looking at all those statistic things, there's one very important thing you miss. Because Russian people, the economy is definitely stagnating. They don't compare their life with this stagnation. They understand that they have less money in their pocket, that there's something wrong going on. But this is not a case for many of them. The case is different. And this actually gives an answer why young people vote for a position while people of elderly age are not voting for them on the majority. Because people compare their life not with this period before stagnation. They compare their life today with their life in the 90s. And this is actually what frightens them off, unfortunately. The life in the 90s, the crisis which happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union was so huge in our country, so damaging for liberal values, because in the minds of millions of people in Russia, liberal values were harshly connected with the crisis and collapse they had, with the real poverty where it was not a question of, not going for a holiday to Turkey, but with a question of not having anything to eat for dinner. So that was a real poverty, and people still remember that time. And compared to them, now everything is so super in Russia. And this is a huge argument for many people all over Russia. They ask one question, which for me was, first of all, a shock. They ask, look, but now life is much better than in the 90s. Of course, we have problems, the West fights with us, and we have, such huge problems inside Russia. But remember what happened in the 90s when Democrats came to power. And this fear is something we have to deal with. Opposition has to deal with Russia. It's the main fear of people, and that's why my hope lies with the young people who were born in the 0 years, millennials, who do not remember the 90s years.
We've got a whole panel to go through, so we're going to come back.
Yeah, sorry, I can speak for hours.
We don't think there's a free media in Russia. Are we right? We're prepared to concede it's nothing perhaps as bad as it was in the Soviet era, when everything was controlled by the Communist Party and central government. But we think pretty much most media is controlled by the state apparatus today. Is that wrong?
No. Media is controlled in Russia, and it's very propagandistic in Russia. Media lies, and what we see on all those channels is awful because it promotes hatred and the attitude of people living in a siege kind of situation. But I agree with Pozner, with Vladimir Pozner, because that's what is now happening on the West too. And actually, before, I didn't realize that as much as when I visited the United States of America during my campaign. I was on all the channels, on all the big channels like CNN, Fox News, all the big American channels. I was amazed by the level. I mean, it's the people on whose interviews I studied as a student, Amanpour, like big
what's
stars.
the point you're trying to make?
Yeah, I was amazed. For example, they asked me questions about Russia and the position like that. They asked, well, but you understand that if Navalny would be let to take part in the elections, of course, he would win Putin, or maybe they will have a second tour. I said, well, I'm against Putin, but it's harshly true, because by all the sociology in Russia, even by independent sociology like Levada, Navalny wouldn't take more than 10% in the current
Sure, but
situation.
they may be wrong about
Look,
Navalny.
and even now you're not going to let me talk.
No,
Let me
I'm
finish,
trying to get
please.
you to address the issue.
Please,
you
let me
cannot
finish.
say that American media is monolithic like Russian media, can you?
Can I finish what I want to say?
No, I'd like you to answer
So
that
I
question.
was amazed by how they force on all the interviews this position, which has nothing to do with reality. And though I'm against, I'm realistic, and I try to say there, look, we want to change the situation, but we have to be realistic. People really support Putin a lot, and we see it by our eyes, by traveling around. We want to change this. We want to educate people, but let's not be also, irrelevant, saying that, Navalny has millions after him, and he will win Putin if he would lead to elections.
All right. So
That's
American
not
media
true.
got Navalny wrong.
So what I want to say, that propaganda goes both
hold
ways.
on. You're not on Russia today now. You're here with the Spectator.
Yes.
The point I'm trying to get you to address is that you cannot credibly argue, I put it to you, that American media, if you've been on MSNBC and CNN
Yes.
and Fox, and I just arrived back from New York this morning, having watched all three and more, you cannot credibly argue that American media is monolithic in the way that Russian media is, surely.
They are not monolithic inside Democratic and Republican, fights, because if you're Republican, you have more pro-Republican channels. If you're Democrat, there are more pro-Democratic channels. But unfortunately now, they're totally monolithic towards the situation in Russia. And I'm watching American media very closely, and what I see, I'm very disappointed, because they're totally monolithic about Russia. You wouldn't find me as a one American big media with a huge report on that the situation around Russia now is not fair, and maybe Russia is not that bad, and it's not an alien. Maybe we should embrace Russia and take it into European Union and make it a part of NATO and be friends with Russia and try to find... I don't say it's a good kind of view, but give me one example of the last 1 year where
I watched
NBC
that very
make that.
conversation, the very conversation you've said, I watched on Morning Joe and MSNBC 2 days ago. in which it was all that all the mistakes the West had made on what the Russians regard as the near abroad, and all the foreign policy errors after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact.
Can you just give me...
yeah, it's called MSNBC, the show's
I've never
called
seen
Morning
something
Show.
like what you're
So
telling.
anyway, that's just, you know, I'm sorry to bring a fact in, but facts do matter every now and then. Give any idea of the pressures that were put on you while you were fighting the campaign?
Yes, of course, but before answering your questions, you know, being a journalist, I want to be really precise with the facts. So freedom of information is very important for all of us, and internet too. So I just want to stretch that Mr. Ambassador was giving us not really correct information. You can find all of you on internet, because on the meeting in on the year 1930 with Yeltsin, the State Secretary of USA, Warren Christopher, was saying not about enlargement. Yes, this is where I start. Was not telling about enlargement of NATO, but about another form which Yeltsin later in '97 supported, a form of partnership of all the countries, including Russia. But he was always against the NATO enlargement in the way it was put. So all of you can check that on the internet.
All right, what's the answer to the question?
About your question, a lot of pressure on people working with us in different regions was put. Several people were put for 15 days in prison. One of them is Andrei Kuznetsov. Another person was in St. Petersburg, who was put for 2 days campaigning for us. One of the people who was working with us, the car was burned. The one who gathered a lot of signatures for while working with us. So we had at least 10 cases where people were threatened by this or that way. Moreover, all of our team, including me, we got a lot of messages with threats, and even I had a, you know, quite frightening situation when I was present at the anniversary of Mikhail Gorbachev. It's the first president of the Russian Federation, Soviet Union, sorry. And at this anniversary, a person came to me and kind of attacked with me, having thrown a glass or something at the face, so I fell down and was kind of frightened. So this situation happened when you are in Russian politics. But this is the risks we all have to take. Many people in Russia are under much bigger pressure when I am. So...
Now I understand you want to stay in politics.
Well, yes, of course. But okay. I understand that this is a very risky situation. It's not kind of taking risks with elections somewhere in Belgium or in, you know, in Liechtenstein.
There are very few risks in Liechtenstein, I can tell you.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Except when the gold bars fall on your feet.
Briefly, I think the main tragedy of Putin is that when he's gone, we'll miss him, because what follows him will be worse. I think it's very clear that actually the nationalism and aggression that has become the staple of Russian political discourse has raised this xenophobia and paranoia to extraordinarily dangerous levels. And I'm extremely grateful for Vladimir Pozner to actually bring us back to the point, what does Russia want? I think part of the answer to the succession is that fundamentally the interests of the Russian people and the Russian elite are opposed, because the Russian elite is interested in preserving its privileges and its ability to steal and its money and itself, and they know that if they allow another team in, they will lose their freedom and their money. And they have systematically designed a system of media control, of political control, that allows them to remain in power by feeding the people lies. And unfortunately, that creates a terrifyingly unstable system. So what's really scary about Russia is not that it's strong, but that it's weak. What's really scary about Putinism is that is not that Putin himself is a terrible manager, he's a terrible president, but he, in order to stay in power, has created an incredibly dangerous and destabilizing myth that will bring Russia to ruin.
And you're well applaud.
No.
Sorry, what are you saying? Sorry?
Well, that's exactly what you want, isn't it? You do. You don't want a strong Russia. That's a lot of blah blah. Nobody wants a strong Russia. Come on now. And nobody cares about democracy in Russia. I mean, look, read the Waltwitz Doctrine. Look what's been written about Russia. There was a time in the early 90s when there was a huge window of opportunity. And there could have been real change. And you touched upon it. And it was not taken. Because in reality, I'm not talking about average people. In reality, the political game is keep Russia down. We don't want this huge bear of a country growling around.
Do the Russian people want democracy?
Well, that's an interesting question. They've never had democracy.
I understand that.
And they've never had it. You know, Zhvanyetsky, our wonderful stand-up comedian writer, has once said, if you've never seen another pair of shoes, ours are the best in the world. See what I'm saying?
I just want to add one very important thing to what Vladimir Pozner just said. We had a small time of democracy in the 90s, and my father was the one with millions of people who went out on the streets, and that was real democracy and real elections. But what those people who went out on the streets, what we saw Reagan, who said, we won the Cold War. But it's not true. It's Russian millions of people who went out against Communist Party who won this war.
But Reagan had gone by the 1990s.
They thought they are
Reagan stood down in 1988.
Can I please finish?
But it's just factually not true.
I can't hear. I'm sorry. You're saying I can't hear what you say.
Yeah, well, all right. Well, I'll say it. If you listen, I'll tell you. You said that there was a brief period where democracy may flower in Russia. But instead, Reagan preferred the Cold War. That brief period was in the 1990s. Reagan was gone by 1988.
He said it.
He's just an ex-president.
What do you mean? Yes, but he said that.
And that swung it in Russia.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying about. I'm saying that was highly translated in Russia, that ex-president was saying those things, that America was translating the idea that we won the Cold War. Okay. The Russians thought that they won this war because they went on the streets against communist regime. And I think the very important thing we have to remember that we should think about how embracing Russia into the European world where it belongs. Because we should remember one example. I don't want to make any comparisons, but I want you all to remember this very frightening example of our history. After the First World War, we had this situation with Germany, where Germany was humiliated, was also kept away by Europe because, you know, they didn't want to be Germany in with all the, you know, the results of the First World War. What we got, you all know. I don't compare it, but you all remember how Europeans changed their tactics upon Germany after the Second World War. And now Germany is one of the main economy of Europe, one of the strongest countries, and one of the main democracies. And they cherish this democracy. The only way to keep Russia safe for all the world is to keep Russia in, not to keep Russia out. Because keeping it like this and saying it's a wild bear and we don't want anything to do with that is a conflict which only will be greater and greater from both parts.
Okay.
So the most
okay,
safe
no, I get the
way
point. It's not a monologue. You've got to let other people speak. Ambassador, I mean, the question is, what does Russia want?
Can I go back to the question? I mean, we seem to be slipping back into the past, but the question was about the future.
Yes, which is what I was going to ask.
And you have a group of people at the moment occupying the most powerful positions in Russia who are all in their mid-60s. They don't intend to give up anytime soon. They don't have the intention of surrendering power voluntarily. So unless Russia falls off a cliff edge, and the Russian economy is nowhere near falling off a cliff edge at the moment, I think we should assume they'll be in power for probably another 10 years. which means that actually the transition will be a transition to a new generation in Russia. Perhaps not quite to Xenia's generation, but to those who are in their 40s or early 50s right now. These are people whose mindset was formed after the Cold War, unlike the present generation of leaders. They are people who have travelled, many of them have been educated abroad. They are, of course, proud patriotic Russians, but they have been subjected to a different range of influences. And frankly, we don't know what they're going to be like, but there is a huge wealth of human talent in Russia, and I think it's at least possible that the generational change will cause quite a substantial change in Russia's outlook.
So, from what you're saying,
the answer is we don't know.
It isn't necessarily the case that authoritarianism is baked in, that this new generation could have different attitudes.
Absolutely, I think they do.
If that's the case,
Xenia will tell you they have different attitudes.
if that's the case, and since the West is getting the blame by some people for snuffing out the short experiment of Russian democracy, what should the West be doing now to encourage that?
Well, the West should be actually articulating a long-term strategy for Russia, and I haven't heard a single Western leader do this in recent years. And we need to be saying, we are objecting and standing up against certain actions by the current Russian government. This is not a crusade against the Russian people. Our long-term objective is what it was before, and I worked for 30 years to try to achieve this, which is actually to bring Russia closer into Europe, to have normal, harmonious relations with a prosperous Russia, allow Russia to develop its own forms of government, which...
But didn't we blow that opportunity? Didn't we have that opportunity and we blew it?
I don't think we blew it. I think it changed with the Orange Revolution, as I said earlier, in 2004. From 1988 to 2004, we and the Soviet Union and then Russia were on convergent courses. We made a lot of progress. The pendulum has now gone for 10 years, 14 years the other way. I think it can go back again in the future.